Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week's program focuses on poverty. Our first guest, Bob Woodson, president and founder of the Center for Neighborhood Enterprises, describes programs designed not to study failure in poor communities, but to identify, study, and expand success. Our second guest, Jim Lacey, is the author of the recently published book Taxofornia, documenting California's headlong rush to impoverish itself through excessive taxation and lavish pay and pension benefits for public employees. First up, let's meet Bob Woodson. Bob, welcome to the show.
Pleased to be here.
Bob, you've been an outspoken civil rights activist since the 60s. You've directed the National Urban League's Administration of Justice Division back in the 70s. In 1981, you founded the Center for Neighborhood Enterprises, focusing on practical approaches to combating poverty. And since you've been awarded a MacArthur's Genius Fellowship, the Bradley Foundation Prize, and the President's Citizen Medal. So how come Al Sharpton has a TV show on MSNBC and you don't?
Well, I think that people to the left of center understand the importance of communication, and so they invest. People on the right are less concerned about that, to their own detriment.
It's as if there are not enough storytellers out there to get the message out, and perhaps that's your role.
It really is, but I think that we're at a critical time in America when people are desperate for solutions. They're tired of the gladiatorial combat that masquerades as political discourse. Mm-hmm. And I really think they're thirsty for real solutions that transcend this ideological divide that everyone seems to enjoy here in Washington.
Well, it's a sport.
We see evidence of this when 3 or 4 different homeless men found $40,000, one of them in a backpack, and turned it into the officials. And there's just been an outpouring on the Internet of people appreciating those kind of fundamental American values of honesty. And so I just think there's a deep thirst on the part of the American public for real solutions to real problems facing America.
And the voice of authenticity that comes with it. You've stated that the civil rights movement has been hijacked. What did you mean by that?
I mean, it has really abandoned the high ground on which it was founded. It has morphed into a race grievance industry, and it's been hijacked by the gay movement. It's been hijacked by the Democratic Party. And so it has lost its authenticity. The recent evidence of the coach of the basketball team in California, where Al Sharpton was going to MC an event where the NAACP was supposed to give the Lifetime Achievement Award to the coach, it proved to be racist. They've known about him for years.
Oh, you mean Don Sterling, the owner? Yep.
Doug Sterling, the owner. For years, he has had all sorts of suits charging him with racism, but he has been a large contributor to the NAACP, so that the civil rights movement, again, has sold its soul to its highest bidder. And as a consequence, it has lost a kind of authenticity, and it has descended from the moral high ground in which it used to reside.
But if racial grievance groups get benefits out of the government for their constituents, doesn't every little bit help?
Well, they're not getting the so-called government benefits. 70% of the money spent on poor people goes not to poor people. It goes to those that serve poor people. Mm-hmm. And so they ask not which problems are solvable, but which ones are fundable. So we've spent $15 trillion on programs to aid the poor, with the bulk of it going to the middle-class providers. And so we have created a commodity out of poor people and wonder why poverty expands as funding increases.
Generally in a market, if you pay more for something, you get more of it. Isn't that usually the case?
That is the case. You get more of it. And it has racial implications. So 2 out of 10 whites with college education works for government. 6 out of 10 blacks with a college education works for government.
No kidding.
So unfortunately, the race grievance industry, as a lot of middle-class blacks are a part of what I call the poverty pentagon as well, where there are perverse incentives for poverty to be addressed, and it's unfortunately The racial implications are that middle-class blacks prosper at the expense of their low-income counterpart, but no one ever discusses this.
Well, let's get into a few details. You've made some very sharp criticisms of what you call the therapeutic model for social services and charity work compared to the reciprocity model. Can you explain the difference?
Yes. Therapeutic intervention works for, I call, middle-class hysterics. I'm trained as a psychiatric social worker. I have a master's from the University of Pennsylvania, so I'm trained in it. And it works for people who are middle class. But for low-income people, the problems that they face cannot be solved by some middle-class professional. Their problems are cultural, it is spiritual, and therefore it needs a different level of intervention. I have been providing assistance to grassroots leaders that have a clear track record of successfully addressing the needs of drug addicts, people who have been prostitutes, people that the therapeutic industry has turned its back on. Jails couldn't threaten them into changing. And yet these faith-based groups are able to successfully challenge and bring about major transformation and redemption of thousands of people that everybody else has failed.
It's funny, you have stated that those programs may be illogical, but they work. And I suppose that's your acid test. Tell us more about that.
Again, I was on a panel with 4 psychiatrists testifying, and I was saying to them that a faith experience works more effectively. My 13-year-old daughter was visiting with me, volunteering for a week at a faith-based program in San Antonio, Texas. Midway through the visit, the wife of the director, who was a reformed drug addict herself, told these 2 women to take my daughter and her 3 granddaughters, take the van, take them to the amusement park and for dinner, and then return them at 9 o'clock. As they were leaving, she said, "Relax, Bob. These 2 women are ex-prostitutes and ex-heroin addicts. The girls will be fine."
And you felt comfortable.
And I felt comfortable with that. So I turned to these psychiatrists and I said, "Tell me, would any of you turn over your daughter to patients that you announced are cured? Do you have that level of confidence in them?"
What'd they say?
Well, there was an embarrassed silence, and everyone in the hearing room laughed because they knew they wouldn't ever do that.
You seem to rely heavily on empowerment. You tell a story of a Christmas gift program and a change in the way that brought recipients forward in a positive manner. Can you recall that?
Yes, most poverty programs and conventional therapeutic interventions, poor people have to pay the price of their own personal dignity. So there was a spousal abuse program in Washington, D.C., where every year the program director would collect presents, and then the volunteers would hand them out to children. Well, everyone was happy except the moms. So what the director did in her wisdom was the following year, all year they enabled these moms to work, volunteer, sew, clean, cook, and earn toy vouchers. And with these toy vouchers, they would go into the store and purchase toys for their own children. And then at the Christmas party, it was the mothers who gave the toys to the children, because what you're doing is empowering them by enabling them to do for their own children what others were doing for them. Nothing empowers a person more and respects their dignity than giving them a chance to give back.
Bill Cosby has made many statements actually in the past about pathologies in the inner city community, in the African American community, and he was loudly shouted down by the left. He's kind of gone quiet lately. How do you take that?
Well, first of all, the only people who were shouting him down were not the people flocking to him. Low-income and middle-income people were flocking to see him. Everywhere he went, they really wanted to hear his message. It's these so-called middle-class spokespersons, the Sharptons of this world, the people who have the microphones. They are the only ones complaining about Cosby. Anytime you talk about personal responsibility, their claim is, "Oh, you're blaming the victim."
You talk about personal responsibility. The so-called war on poverty turns 50 this summer. Has it achieved the goals that Lyndon Johnson set out to accomplish?
Absolutely not. It has done just the opposite. In fairness, there are two areas that I think the war on poverty was very successful. At the time that Bobby Kennedy was walking through Appalachia, there were children there dying of starvation with large stomachs. There were elderly people in Miami dying with no food in their stomachs. And so the federal government rightly intervened with child nutrition programs and helps for the elderly. So we don't have that condition anymore.
Right.
But the bulk of what they have done is really convert billions of dollars of government money into services for the poor. Funding schools of social work, psychologists, drug counselors, all professional providers at our universities. They then crafted remedies for the poor that were then parachuted into these low-income communities with the expectation that the poor would participate. And so if the poor did not respond by improving their conditions, rather than challenging the nature of the intervention, what we did instead is said, oh, it's inadequately funded.
Right, we need more money.
More money. These folks are worse off than we thought. And so you have an escalation that the more they've done to undermine the people there to serve, the more they get rewarded by expanded budgets.
And of course, you're also creating a very reliable political constituency to vote for the party that provides that funding.
Absolutely. Bill Bennett, the former education secretary, framed the issue beautifully when he said, when liberals look at the poor, they see a sea of victims, and conservatives, when they look at the poor, they see a sea of aliens. And there's an old African proverb that when bull elephants fight, the grass always loses. And so the poor have been the losers from these bipolar debates between the left and the right. So the right says, well, what the left is doing hasn't worked, so why don't we just cut the budgets and then open the doors of the free enterprise system and let meritocracy determine winners and losers? I believe that the answer is neither ignoring them or exploiting them. The answer is to seek among the people suffering the problem solutions and look for answers among what I call the social entrepreneurs that are indigenous to low-income communities.
And I understand one of the programs that you headed up is shining a spotlight on people who get it right, rather than spending all the time lamenting the people who get it wrong.
You know, that's why the name enterprise is in our name, because we believe that the principles that operate in our market economy should also work in our social economy. In our market economy, 70% of all new jobs are created by the entrepreneurs, even though they're only 3% of the population. And entrepreneurs tend to be C students, not A students. A students come back to universities and teach. C students come back and endow.
I've never heard that, but there's a lot to be said for that quote.
Yeah, because, see, smart people have to have all the answers before they act, and when they act, the opportunity's gone.
Right.
But see, C students are people that are able to act in the presence of their doubts and uncertainties. And so they can act 100% on the 30% that they do know.
You talk about the importance of entrepreneurialism and education. There was a Reason piece that came out a couple of days ago. It was jumping on the Donald Sterling controversy, and it quoted 3 policies that are more racist than Donald Sterling: occupational license barriers, the drug war, and the public school monopoly. Would you agree that these 3 things are holding back African Americans more than racists and bigots?
Absolutely. The issue isn't race. Race is a problem. It's not the most important problem. If race were the cure for it, the question is, why are African American children failing in systems run by their own people? But no one ever talks about that. Social service systems, social welfare agencies, healthcare systems, education systems in urban centers are all primarily run by professional blacks.
And they seem to be the greatest recipients of these programs rather than the clients they're trying to help.
Absolutely. So the issue isn't race, it's class, and it's a inverse market arrangement where the more you fail, the more you get paid. We have, again, created a commodity out of the poor where people prosper as a result of the market they create.
You've spoken out against the license barriers that keep ex-cons from integrating back into the community, because almost every professional license, which is now required for almost 40% of professions, excludes former felons.
It really does. If you return from prison, you cannot get an occupational license. Mm-hmm. And also, the cosmetology board that makes a person spend $12,000 and $15,000 to learn to cut hair.
Right.
And in some cases, hair braiders are required to go and become hairdressers, even though they don't do what hairdressers do. So these are the kind of common sense pedestrian issues that are more anti-poor than a lot of other issues.
Well, let's talk about the drug war that imprisons so many young African Americans.
My take on that is people shouldn't be dealing drugs.
Well, it's a good message, but it's hard to take what really is a public health problem, which is drug abuse, and turn it into a public safety problem by criminalizing all these people.
We have to be careful down this slippery slope, because we took alcoholism and drug addiction and made it an illness. And as a consequence, a lot of people that are on Skid Row have qualified for SSI. Mm-hmm. And in Denver, Colorado, 30 to 40 checks every month went to the bar owner to pay off their monthly mm-hmm. bill. And alcohol deaths peaked at the time when these SSI checks arrived.
Because we define it as an illness rather than a choice.
We defined it as an illness rather than a crime or sin. So I think we've got to be very, very careful when we do that. We can injure with the helping hand.
Well, it's a complex issue, that's for sure.
No, it is.
The charter school movement has made tremendous inroads in minority communities. One of the positive things that came out of Hurricane Katrina was washing away the disastrous public school monopoly there and allowing charter schools to flourish. They seem to be very highly supported in the black community, but the teachers' unions and their supporters in the Democratic Party seem to have declared war on charter schools. Where do you stand on that?
I stand very strongly for charter schools. I also stand strong on vouchers to give low-income parents the same educational options enjoyed by all of the civil rights leaders. I'm in Washington, D.C. Eleanor Holmes Norton, Jesse Jackson Jr., even the superintendent of schools send their children to Sidwell Friends mm-hmm. School while opposing the same option for inner-city kids. It's interesting that the highest support for these school options are in the black community, but the civil rights leadership and the Democratic Party are unalterably opposed to them. So you have an intra-group class division here, again, that we don't talk about very often. But I'm also for strengthening public schools as well.
The hypocrisy of the Democratic Party certainly hasn't cost them any votes in the minority community, so why should they stop?
No, it hasn't. But if you look at the voter apathy, I mean, when these members of the Black Caucus are elected, only 25% of the vote. There is tremendous voter apathy. And that's why I'm encouraging the Republican Party to be competitive. That's one of the reasons why I'm taking Paul Ryan once a month to visit low-income leaders that have triumphed over poverty and despair. So perhaps he can instruct others of his party in ways that they can be competitive. It is really hostile to the interest of America for Black America to be a solely owned subsidiary of one political party.
Is Paul Ryan listening?
Very much so. He has visited more low-income communities probably than any member of the Black Caucus.
No kidding.
Yes.
Do you think he'll be able to effectively spread the word in the Republican Party?
Well, I think it's already generating a lot of support. But I think that Paul is a man of principle, and I think principle will always prevail. And the reason that I'm spending this time with him is because I think the black community needs to be competitive like every other group. The very fact that President Obama can take a position on gays, on women, on Hispanics, but doesn't have to do anything or spend any money in the black community. For 5 years, he hasn't mentioned the word poverty.
He can take it for granted. That's why he gets away with it.
And so that's dangerous, I think, for the country. To me, the example of the failure of liberal democratic politics for blacks is Detroit, Michigan. Detroit looks like Hiroshima did 65 years ago after the bomb struck.
Yep.
There's this picture of Hiroshima when it was bombed, and then Detroit when it was a shining city on the hill.
I've seen it. It's an amazing comparison, then and now.
Yes.
Bringing Detroit back is going to be quite a challenge.
Yeah, I think they're about to make it farmland again.
That might be the best way. But getting back to making Republicans more competitive in the African-American community, do you believe that there's an irredeemable taint of racism in the hearts of many conservative Republicans?
Absolutely not. I do not believe that. I'll give you an example of just where blacks come down on this. Some years ago, the Washington Post reported on 40 members of the Ku Klux Klan who came to the district in a rickety old school bus, and 3,000 people tried to, grab them, and they had to be protected by the police. But the Washington Post reporter went in a high crime area in the black community and asked this old black guy if he was going to join the demonstration. And his response was, well, bring the Klan down here if they can get rid of these drug dealers.
No.
For people living in these high crime areas, you got to understand that black America is experiencing a 9/11 every 6 months. 3,000 blacks are killed by other blacks every 6 months.
Now, how does that compare to white on black crime?
Only about 30 blacks are killed by non-blacks in the course of a year.
How come every one of those makes the news, and the 3,000 that are slaughtered, we never see them?
Well, because Al Sharpton can get on television and he has a microphone. He acts as if the greatest problem that we face is white on black crime, and the press helps him with that. Do you realize this past Easter weekend, 50 shootings occurred just in Chicago?
No. Wow.
A 3-year-old girl was killed. 50 people were shot over the Easter weekend.
This is a Democrat-controlled city with very strict gun laws.
Democratic-controlled city where Ron Emanuel, former aide to Obama, is now mayor. Right in Obama's backyard, where he spent millions of dollars in stimulus money to address that problem.
So what went wrong?
Because, again, we continue to fund failed policies. We do not look for innovation. Someone said if you keep doing what you do, you keep getting what you got.
That makes sense. In the time left, maybe you can talk a little bit about the role that family formation plays in alleviating poverty.
One has to understand that black America is often the moral barometer of the health of America. And it's wrong to believe that just racism and lack of economic opportunity explains the breakup of the family. If you look at up until 1968, 85% of all black families had a man and a woman raising children.
Mm-hmm.
That meant that 10 years of the Depression, 25% unemployment rate for whites, 40% for blacks. Yet we had a higher marriage formation rate during those 10 years of the Depression than white America.
Didn't break up the family.
That all changed with the start of the war on poverty, when liberal social planners, according to Fred Siegel in his book about New York, the social planners after the riot said, it's racist to expect black America to conform to the same moral standards, family formation as the rest of America. And so we changed. And our policies then help the breakup of the family. And if you have a child out of wedlock, you can get support. The more babies you have, the more support you can receive. There were all kinds of policies that were anti-family. And as a consequence, only 30% of the children today in the black community are born in two-parent households.
And that certainly is reflected in the poverty statistics.
It really is, but what the center believes that the solutions are to stop studying failure. You can learn nothing from studying failure except how to create it. So what we do at the Center for Neighborhood Enterprise, we go into low-income communities and we go among the 30% and ask how many people are raising children that are not dropping out of school or in jail and drugs. And then we find out from the 30% why and how they are able to achieve against the odds. And then what lessons can we learn from them that can be applied to the 70%.
Bob, how can listeners learn more about your work?
They can go online, www.cneonline.org. That's cneonline.org, or give us a call at 202-518-6500 in Washington, D.C.
Bob, thanks so much for your terrific work, and thank you for being on the program.
Thank you so much.
That was Bob Woodson, president and founder of the Center for Neighborhood Enterprises, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Ahead, Jim Lacey, author of Taxifornia, describes how Californians have gone deep in hock to support their public employee unions, impoverishing the state and threatening its fiscal viability. Stay tuned.